Okay, so this is not the intro to Skip because we're taking the podcast from just this thing that hopefully helps all of us think more deeply and is an attempt to bring us to the table and find some common ground to something that's actually trying to do something in the physical world. I'm going to have a couple of t-shirts going on sale for charity that'll be available for about a week and shooting to raise money for up to 4 organizations depending on how many we sell. The first one is for a group called Life After Hate, which helps people leave the white power movement, which is probably the most effective way to combat it because unfortunately the more counter rioting goes on, the more that people like that actually feel like they're a part of something that matters. And my friend Christian actually started this group after being a white power guy himself and realizing that he just wanted something to belong to and wasn't ever like a true blue believer in any of this stuff, right? And so we can have riots and counter riots all we want, but it's not necessarily going to fix the root of the problem, and Life After Hate is. So I wanted to raise some money for them. Also, there's a Chicago literacy group that helps people who haven't finished their high school diploma get that, and the domestic abuse hotline, and also finally the local boxing club, Straight Up Boxing, which trains underprivileged kids regardless of their ability to pay here in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So what do all those things have to do with each other? Well, the t-shirts, one of them is an anti-Nazi, anti-communist t-shirt, and the other one is a t-shirt designed around the Floyd Mayweather and Conor McGregor fight. And so obviously the communist Nazi t-shirt ties into Life After Hate. The other 3 things are all connected to Floyd Mayweather being a piece of garbage as a human being who should be serving 30 plus years in prison for domestic abuse right now, but got out of it because he was rich. So want to raise money for the domestic abuse hotline, and the t-shirt actually has the hotline and the website on the back of it for the Mayweather-McGregor fight, saying if you need help, here's where it is. And then obviously Mayweather's a boxer, so wanted to fund a boxing club that's helping kids, and Mayweather can't read, so I wanted to fund something that helps adults who were not able to finish high school or didn't for some reason get up to speed so they can get jobs. Those are going to be $25 each or 2 for $40. They're not on sale quite yet, so I can't put it in the show notes, but they should be up later today. And the designs, people have been going crazy over. I've already sold several just by putting up some mock-ups yesterday saying, when can I buy these? So if you want to kick in $25 or $40, this is technically a portion of the proceeds go, not your whole, amount, because I'm paying the designer because that's what you do when somebody does good creative work. And the t-shirts are not free. It's not like I was able to buy a few thousand t-shirts and donate them and your whole $25 goes there. We got to pay for shipping, we got to pay for the shirt. But you're getting a really, really cool shirt or two. And, you're helping to support up to 4 organizations, depending on how many of these we sell. And so it's just about stuff that's going on right now and how you and I can be a part of the solution. And I think I'm going to start doing this as a recurring kind of bit, finding something that's going on right now and providing a fantastic shirt. One other thing, there is a beer bottle opener. Actually, I believe we're going to use shirts with a beer bottle opener sewn into the hem. So if you wear the Mayweather-McGregor shirt to the fight next Saturday at a bar, you can actually open your own beer bottle, which is pretty exciting. Neighbors Again with Seth Tower Hurd on Facebook, Seth Tower Hurd on Twitter, Seth Tower Hurd on Instagram. You can always email me directly, sethtowerhurd@gmail.com. Pretty much everything is Seth Tower Hurd, so it's easy to find me, okay? I'm excited to see what happens. Would love for you to participate in that. Second solo show. Didn't think I was going to do this again, but I got a lot of fantastic feedback, and so we're going to do it again. Next week, we're going to be back to guests, but I think these solo shows are going to become a regular part of what Neighbors Again is. All right, let's get into it. Let's be neighbors again.
And if we can't walk in love, we're a noisy little gong, a bitter little song that a bully sings out of key. And if we can't walk in peace, we'll forget about the least of these. A mother crying on her knees for a boy who's locked away. There's a voice calling me.
So the second show in a row where I'm just doing this thing on my own, and I didn't actually think there would be enough response to this to keep doing it, but actually it was one of the episodes I've gotten the most feedback on, just sitting down and talking. And so although we've actually done a recent episode, you can go back and grab it maybe 5 to 7 episodes ago, about what to do with particularly Confederate monuments here in the United States. I wanted to get deeper into this topic, and then next week I think we're going to be back to having 2 guests in a week. Although that that could look like something slightly different. Of course, the bigger issue in Charlottesville is the violence that's happened and the fact that Nazis are showing their faces in the United States. But there's so much discussion going on about monuments that does not fit in a tweet. And so I thought we just needed to go point by point through this and really talk about, like, how do we remember and how do we discuss our history? Because we don't. The average, so about 1 in 5 people who graduate from college never reads another book. That's so hard for me. So where I grew up just absolutely steeped in history, and history being one of my favorite subjects and being super, super important to me, and you taking the step out to consume like a nonpartisan, kind of news and current events outlet like this, you're doing more than a lot of people do to engage in civil discourse. But if you never read another book ever again, it's very, very difficult to be a good citizen and to be able to think objectively and vote and be engaged because, my gosh, you're not thinking about where we came from. So you just kind of want what you want in that 5 minutes. You're like a political gnat. It's like, oh, well, that makes me mad. Oh, I'll swing the other way. And that's how, my fear is that we're going to now continue to swing from hard left to hard right, or alt left to alt right in our elections. And I'm wanting to slow the pendulum down here. So let's just go point by point. And of course, the first one is the Robert E. Lee statue itself that's scheduled to be torn down, that the white supremacists, rallied around, which, by the way, I don't think they actually care. I think what the KKK folks saw here is that they could normalize themselves by saying, hey, look at us. We also don't want to erase history. All right. So the reason they picked this is not because they actually love General Robert E. Lee. The reason they picked this is because they could normalize themselves. Okay. By the way, Robert E. Lee, if you did not read this yet, did not want, kind of this lost cause, this, forgotten hero narrative to happen. He knew he lost a war, and I don't know what he thought about at the end of his life because I haven't read any of his biographies. That's not something I've been super into. But he did not want this. So as far as a Robert E. Lee statue, should it come down? Robert E. Lee thought so. Okay. But as far as all Civil War statues, you have to start to question, whether or not, like, when we take all this stuff down, we'll have anything left to discuss. And there's this weird thing now with not weird, it's been very calculated, but this thing with the alt left, the hard left, whatever you want to call it, people that are outside the bounds of normal democracy and are very angry and really don't like America, don't like the idea of America or anything else, that are going for some kind of socialism or some kind of flipped system from what we've got right now. That group would say there's no, we should not have any monuments to the Confederacy at all. And if you don't have enough empathy to see why somebody could possibly fight for the Confederacy, which, by the way, it's a place where there was 4% slave ownership, and only 6 states seceded in the beginning, and then because of some of, I would argue Lincoln's blunders, the other 7, that made the 13 states of the Confederacy seceded. I'm going to read a piece from the New York Times here. If you got kids in the car or whatever, please maybe finish this podcast later or skip ahead about 3 minutes, because this is going to get fairly graphic. Okay. And this is about rape in this by Union soldiers in the Civil War. Black women were even in more danger. Rape was one of the many horror stories of slavery, though whites rarely recognized it as such. Interestingly, it was in the context of war that Southern whites for the first time were forced to acknowledge the rape of black women. In the spring of 1863, John N. Williams of the 7th Tennessee Regiment wrote in his diary, "Heard from home, the Yankees had been through there. Seemed their object to commit rape of every Negro woman they could find. Many times, troops and ruffians rape black women while forcing white women to watch, a horrifying experience for all and a proxy of rape for white women. B.E. Harrisburg of Leesburg, Virginia, wrote a letter to President Abraham Lincoln complaining that federal troops had raped his servant girl in the presence of his wife. General William Dwight reported Negro women were ravished in the presence of white women and children. Just as rape of white women implied that Southern men were unable to protect their mothers, wives, and daughters, the rape of slave women told whites that they could no longer protect their property. So there were, I believe, almost 500 prosecuted Union soldiers prosecuted for rape. And I would say maybe, this is totally subjective, but maybe 1 in 100 actually went to prosecution. And we know that General Sherman was told to basically bring the world down, right? At the end of this thing. So why could anybody have fought for the Confederacy? Well, the 96% who didn't own slaves, I think we can say at least some of them saw their homeland being invaded, and they had to pick between the lesser of two evils. And if your cousin got raped, you're probably going to want to go kill the army that did that, as opposed to do nothing. Okay. When the Union Army went through East Tennessee, the majority of those people had never seen a slave. The majority of those people had never been within, more than 20 miles away from their home. There's one case of a town in Missouri that the Union burned down out of retaliation, and it was built back, and the Union burned it down again. So, Sherman's March to the Sea is obviously the most famous one, which, by the way, in my high school history teacher that had a huge influence on my life, I got a hold of her, a decade later and said, like, we said this was a good thing because it brought a faster into the war. Do you think that? And she's like, no, absolutely not. I was told, I was told to teach the text, so I taught the text. So the fact that we even justify that in the North is really screwed up. We teach our high school kids that it is okay to rape women, murder people, and burn things down as long as it brings the end to a war. At that point, we are Imperial Japan. We are the Nazis. We are the Russians. One of the things that makes us democracy is we don't harm innocent people in war, okay? Which, again, that's another mistake Lincoln made. I think Lincoln had a fantastic last 18 months of his presidency, and that's why we love him so much. And he was very courageous in many ways. He screwed up a lot of stuff along the way. And one of those things was he was the first post-Renaissance Western leader to deny food and medicine to civilians during wartime. So he was happy, maybe not happy, but willing to let civilians die to bring this war to an end quicker. And that gets into a little bit of a moral quandary, saying, well, maybe he was saving, he was letting, hundreds of children die of preventable disease to save tens of thousands of soldiers. I don't know how you judge that. But it totally happened. So this idea that, oh my gosh, how could anyone ever fight for the South? They all had to have been, racist. And if your ancestors fought for the South and you have any interest in that at all, you're a racist. You're not a racist, okay? Unless you are. You're either, but if your ancestors fought in the Civil War and they didn't own slaves and they weren't racist, I don't see any problem with remembering that history. Okay. We got to get into the story of Jesse James here, because where I grew up, right across the river from Hannibal, Missouri on the Illinois side, Jesse James is a folk hero. All right. Jesse James did not rob banks to get rich. Jesse James robbed banks because they were owned by Union officers who had gotten super rich off the Civil War. And they had hung him because they were, stealing from his farm and he'd stepped in. They hung him and then they cut him down before he actually died, because they decided that executing a 14-year-old and 15-year-old kid was a really, even like a 14, 15-year-old white boy, that could blow back on him. They also, I believe, killed his stepfather. I did an episode on my last podcast about this whole thing, which I might put back up, kind of put in the feed here if you want to check that out later. He thought of himself as, like Moses almost, that he was, or Robin Hood. He was trying to steal from people who had stolen from people who were like him, just common, non-pro-slavery white people who happen to live in the South. and give the money back. And he hid out in the cave in Hannibal, Missouri. He's a freaking folk hero. So this idea that you can't see any kind of complexity to Jesse James's story or to the people of East Tennessee who saw an army marching through and fought back, that just shows a complete lack of any kind of perspective and empathy. Okay. Let's get into the fact that history is not a movie, because this is the problem. Like, we need a narrative. And sometimes there is a narrative, right? Like sometimes it is us versus the Nazis, and there's so many great movies made because it truly is good versus evil. A lot of times, it's not a story. It's a bunch of things that happen, and a lot of things were bad. It doesn't follow the beats of a Hollywood movie story, right? The Civil War was one of those things where there was a lot of really, really terrible things at the same time. The rape of slave women by their owners was just, I can't even get my head around it. It's so disturbing. But the rape of slave women by Union soldiers is just as freaking bad. And if you don't get that, then you're living in a very isolated world where the only people who are sane and reasonable are the people who are exactly like you, which is a pretty small number of people. All right. Lincoln, definitely goes down as a good president, without a doubt. He made some huge mistakes. Part of the reason that we love him so much in America is we love a comeback story, right? He got it all right at the end. The war would have been over in a year had he not been such a bad tactician. You can really screw up a lot, but when you free millions of people, we're still going to love you, right? But we need to stop thinking of this whole thing as, well, every single event in history has to be a movie, right? As far as who gets monuments, who doesn't, what gets torn down. Personally, I freaking hate Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a Christian. I believe he's in hell, and there's certainly a growing number of Christians who will say there's not hell or hell's not eternal, which this is not a theology show. So I can point you to some great resources. If you're interested in that topic, you can hit me up on social media or whatever. I can't stand the guy. All right. However, had he not prepared us for World War II, Europe might still be in the hands of the Nazis. All right. The reason I hate FDR, by the way, he wanted to put Asians in internment camps. Like, he was talking about this in the 1930s when there was no cause. He wanted this. He absolutely wanted Japanese people in internment camps because he didn't trust them. And he hated Jews, and he sent Jews back to Europe who had escaped on boats to come to the United States for refuge. He sent them back to Europe to be put in the ovens of concentration camps. All right. He is a disgusting person, and not just because he married his cousin, but because he's an abhorrent racist. However, he changed the fate of the world in a good way. And we cannot deny that. Just like we cannot deny that the fact that Woodrow Wilson, who helped bring the KKK back without a doubt, also could have prevented World War II. And this idea that we're going to chip Wilson off of Princeton right now, which Wilson helped, make Princeton what it is, that's insane. Woodrow Wilson, had he had his way, would have saved maybe 100 million people's lives, because World War II would have been prevented, or would have been much more isolated. It would have been a Japan-China conflict. The reason World War II happened is because we set up someone like Hitler to come to power by creating such financial ruin in Central Europe that and making, quote, the loser pay for the war. The Germany was so desperate that somebody like Hitler seemed reasonable. Because when you're hungry and somebody tells you there's a way not to be starving, you just kind of go with it, even if some of the other things he says in a time when you weren't so desperate would seem like bonkers, like blaming the Jews for everything, right? Woodrow Wilson could have prevented all that. And whatever else he is, we cannot deny that fact. So to erase that, we're not building a monument to his sins. We're building a monument to his strengths. And this is about the American narrative more than the man itself, right? And to get into that, like, we have to talk about like MLK. MLK had a lot of side chicks, all right? You know what? And if we're gonna do that, as far as building monuments to people who had a whole bunch of affairs, freaking Michael Jordan outside the United Center. a friend of mine has been the chaplain in the NBA finals. And the NBA, like the actual whole league, like the teams like are set up to like accommodate mistresses and wives. It's gross. It's freaking disgusting. So with MLK, with all the MLK drives and boulevards and statues, are we celebrating the fact that he was a serial cheater? Or are we saying that this person brought about the most important aspects of the civil rights movement? And that's tough, right? But if we take these things down completely wholesale, which if we only put up people who are not controversial, we are not going to have any monuments to anyone because someone's not going to like something, okay? If we take all these things down, we stop discussing where we came from. And in my opinion, this is an actual threat to, like quote unquote national security, because democracy always hangs by a thread. And it depends on the fact that you and I are engaged and not stupid. Down to like, there was an alderman who's in jail right now in Kenosha, who ran unopposed in a pretty good, I would say, fairly affluent neighborhood of town. 4 years ago, this guy actually was accused of gluing a rival politician's car door shut because he was pissed off about something. This dude is in prison or in jail right now for stalking his ex-girlfriend. He ran unopposed. If you wonder how democracy falls apart, it's when we start letting people like that in because everybody's so checked out or focused on national politics that like your local and state houses rot with people who are disturbing individuals because you let them in because you weren't paying attention. All right. If we do not know who we are as a people, if we cannot discuss these things, we will forget everything and we will be a political gnat that only wants what I'm upset about in the next 5 minutes. And democracy will fail like that. And I hate speaking in absolutes like that because it's one of the reasons I started this show is to not kind of do that cable news thing where it's like everything is an emergency. It's like we're always on terror alert. We're always watching for ISIS, right? But if we're stupid, it's going to fall apart. It is going to fall apart. It's a great system. Actually, the balance of power across 3 branches is a great system. But it still depends on people. And the more the average person has no idea who the heck we are or how we got here, and you can interpret those things however you want. I'm concerned about you actually engaging in them. If you cannot discuss those things and you cannot think beyond what you see right now, we're screwed. We are. I see no better example of this than I've used this example several times. But I see no better example than thinking that the worst president ever was one of the ones that was in your lifetime. Which for a lot of us, it's Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump. None of those are the worst presidents. And you can be as angry at Trump as you want right now. Andrew Johnson, who followed Lincoln, they ran like on it was a different political system back then. I can't remember if it was like the person who got second wound up being vice president or they just ran on a mixed ticket. Republicans and Democrats used to run together to try to unify things. Andrew Johnson intentionally screwed up Reconstruction. He hated rich white people in the South because he blamed them as a poor white person, and he hated black people. So he destroyed the freaking economy of part of our country out of personal revenge. And those areas, a lot of those areas have still not recovered. He is the worst president we've ever had. And if you can't see that, again, like you're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. All right. Reagan to now, nobody has destroyed an entire part of the economy and brought down rich and poor alike out of personal vendetta. Didn't happen. It'll never happen again. When we start taking this stuff away, we start to erode our ability to have these discussions and to have art and statues that spur on these discussions. I want to take this a little further. In Chicago, now there's this call to bring down the George Washington statue, which is pretty prominent. The guy who's leading this, and like kind of the University of Chicago academia is getting behind this. Go with me here if you're not from Illinois, not from the Midwest. There's some pretty big statues in Chicago and some pretty big like moments of history. And academia and everybody's like, oh yeah, we should do that. and my apologies for not getting this gentleman's name who's leading the charge here for using the quote, but you can Google it and figure it out. There's no plausible way that we would ever erect a statue to Malcolm X in Mount Greenwood, Lincoln Park, or any of that. Not to say that Malcolm X was a bad guy, they just would not go for it. Native Americans would not even think about putting up a Custer statue because of the atrocities that plagued Native Americans. A little redundant. And for them to say to us, just accept it, is actually insulting. Okay. So by the way, those are all traditionally very white neighborhoods. Okay. George Washington risked everything, and for this nation. And he was a guy that he had multiple horses shot out from underneath him. He had bullet holes in his hat and in his clothing at various times. He was not like one of these British generals that watched up on the hill as the masses slaughtered themselves. Okay. Was he a slave owner? Yes, absolutely. Did he let his slaves go at the end of his lifetime? Yes. How should he be judged on that basis, as opposed to, like, as I've said before, a slave owner in South Carolina that pretty much had 100% quote unquote turnover because they worked people to death or beat them to death every 5 years or so. You're going to have to be the judge of that, right? I mean, the same thing with Thomas Jefferson, as I said in the last episode, who was against slavery and planned on freeing his slaves. And just could never quite get out of enough debt because he was terrible with money. So he never did it, but wanted to end slavery. That's the thing. Most of these people who had to compromise, who were from the North or were anti-slavery when the country was being founded, most of them thought, well, we got to compromise now so that we can beat the British. But this thing is going to be stamped out in 40 years or so. All right. So, why not, if we're going to go that far, if we're going to say no Washington, no Jefferson, whatever, if we're going to go that far, then what about no John Adams? I mean, he voted, he compromised, right? I mean, he agreed to work with people, even though he was like a true blue Yankee from Massachusetts. He agreed to work with people who were slaveholders. Why not erase him, right? And so what do you do? What do you do with this if you're, a black person or, a minority or whatever? I think you discuss it. Like, I think you do what the rest of us do. There is nothing that's going to erase the pain or the effects of what slavery did in this country. All right. There's nothing that's ever going to erase that. It's never going to be completely fixed. Taking down a couple more monuments so that we have less of an idea of where we came from is not going to remedy anything. Actually, taking down these monuments it's literally not going to remedy anything, with the exception of like General Lee and some of these Civil War ones, to ask black people to pay to upkeep these statues to quote unquote heroes who fought to keep them in chains, is reprehensible. Like, these need to be moved onto private property or something like that, or the actual messaging on the statues needs to be changed to say, hey, this guy fought for this. By the way, he did these really bad things as well, which I would argue for everybody. I would love it when you visited like an FDR statue, for it to say like his good points and his bad points so that we're discussing it. And there's not to say that nothing should ever come down. Kenosha is a really freaking Italian town. All right. And there's a statue to Christopher Columbus in my neighborhood where, there's my neighborhood, by the way, has, a decent number of Native Americans in it, of Indians, Cherokee, and a few Wisconsin tribes. Right. Columbus committed genocide when he landed against the Native people. He enslaved Native people. And the Vikings freaking discovered this area anyway. It's just he brought this. They discovered North America anyway. He just brought like some knowledge to Central Europe that hadn't gotten down there from Northern Europe. I would love to see that statue taken down. The reason we have Columbus Day is because Italians like wanted their own hero, right? I would love for that to be taken down. I don't think there's a valid argument. But I'm not about our history being erased. All right. I just don't think that guy did much of anything. At all. And I don't think he's significant enough. He never got to the mainland United States for us to need a statue of a guy that like was in the Caribbean in the middle of Wisconsin. All right. Okay. So let's just go ahead and get into a couple questions real quickly. We got to wrap this thing up. I got to get on the road. I got some things to do today. So first of all, if you have not, if you don't follow on social media, the website Clickhole, I believe it is, which is like kind of making fun of BuzzFeed and that type of thing. It's some of the funniest stuff on the internet, and I also love the satire of how many dumb, clickbait websites there are. Headline from this week: Next Level Gaming. The new Call of Duty penalizes players for shooting Nazis who were actually very fine people. Obviously mocking Trump's just disastrous press conference this week. That's absolutely brilliant. Question from who said this one? I forgot. Oh, yeah, Emily Menace, who I went to college with. She said, keeping up with your podcast, and just to clarify, does the argument that democratic socialism is different than communism not hold water for you at all? No, I totally think those are different things. So democratic socialism would be like a Bernie Sanders where he wants a lot more government involvement. I find it to be pretty concerning because I don't think it's going to work. The reason I'm against universal health care is because I think I might die over it and a lot of other people might die over it. And that's not going off of any kind of conspiracy theory. That's looking at the Charlie Gard case, where England wouldn't let the parents bring this baby to the United States for some treatment that could have saved his life. Because that's the kind of system they have. Canada currently runs about 20 weeks behind on a lot of specialty stuff. People with cancer in Canada, some of them get treatment. Like, I know somebody whose dad, had brain cancer and it would have been millions of dollars. He paid nothing. He's fine. I also know that there's a lot of people from Canada who come down to the United States and pay cash if they can, because we are still the number one place in the world to survive cancer at the 5-year mark. Okay. And when the government has to be paying for this thing and they run out of money, there is only rationing. Okay. Healthcare is really, really expensive, and there is only raising taxes or getting more money or rationing. And you can't raise taxes forever. So I find that to be pretty concerning. But do I think that a democratic socialist like Bernie Sanders is a socialist, like people who want what's happening in Venezuela or what happened and didn't work in a lot of countries around the world in the 20th century? Absolutely not. I disagree with democratic socialism, and I'm happy to discuss that with anybody. I don't see that as a total enemy of democracy. Out and out socialism is a total enemy of democracy. Okay. None of our, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, whatever, none of them died fighting democratic socialism. A lot of them died fighting communism. Okay. And you can agree or disagree as you like with, the Korean War, which, gave us one of our strongest allies and one of the best economies in the world in South Korea, and the Vietnam War, which we could have won but didn't, and, wound up. I think Vietnam could be South Korea 2.0 today, but we chose not to win it. You can think whatever you want about those two wars. There's no denying that we died fighting communism. And yeah, I think that is antithetical to the United States, period. Second one, how do you think the Supreme Court would apply to the Brandenburg test in Charlottesville? Freedom of speech and press does not permit the state to forbid advocacy of those of force of law, except when such advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and likely to incite or produce such action. I'm curious, especially with the hypothetical situation where the demonstrators did not turn violent. In other words, is it possible to imminently incite lawlessness without actually breaking the law? Okay. I love getting the Supreme Court stuff here. And again, this is a very, very difficult situation where in a way I almost have to defend free speech, and I hate that it's white supremacists who are using it. But going back to this, the situation in Charlottesville, the ACLU, traditionally thought of as very liberal, heavily black organization, did legally make sure that these white supremacists could protest because free speech is that important. Do I think that people who've been granted a permit to protest are inciting riots, basically? I don't. It's disgusting. I hate these people. I think that once they put one toe out of line, they should be put in jail. And as much as we can find out who they are responsibly and out them and make sure that they don't have jobs and are not welcome in our towns, absolutely. That concerns me, however, because the fact that people have already been misidentified and had to flee and hide because they were misidentified as Nazis who were marching openly, and that's the fact that somebody would go terrorize somebody based on something that was said on Twitter is scary. Okay, without a doubt, it's scary. But I go back to, I hate the white power movement. I'm selling T-shirts to help raise money for an organization that helps people leave the white power movement. I carry a gun, and God forbid that, my Jewish wife was attacked. No Nazi's been able to kill any member of my family yet, and they've had good chances. So good luck on that one. But do I think that these people were out to incite a riot, and therefore should lose their freedom of speech? I don't. And that's hard. I hate saying that. But that's how much I believe in freedom of speech. I believe that freedom of speech is the cornerstone of the American experiment. And if we don't have it, I don't know where it goes. Like I said, I did another video on this. At the Chicago Pride Parade this year, Jews were kicked out of the parade because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they were told that the Star of David was a hate symbol. Okay, was hate speech, and you can go back and watch that video. But once we don't allow Nazis to protest peacefully, we get into a situation where somebody can decide that being Jewish is a hate crime, and I don't want to go there. Man, that's tough. All right, we'll wrap it up there. Be back to kind of the guest format next week. If you like this thing where we're kind of doing social media questions, which I really do, hit me with some feedback, hit me with questions, and I think that this is going to be like a regular recurring situation. Thanks for wherever you're at, being willing to go on this journey with me and think deeply. And I mean, seriously, don't forget, like, this American experiment, it is in our hands now. The people who are brilliant and architected it and fought and died for it, or died old in their beds seeing it work, those people are gone. And the ones who fought Nazis and who fought communists to keep the idea of democracy and equality moving forward, those people are all dying too. So now we're all we got. And what we do with this, and there's a lot of us, right? There's a lot of common citizens. What we do with this will determine the fate of the nation, and will shape the world. And we forget we have that kind of power just by participating in the civic process. But it's the truth. We're all we got.